Greetings, fellow traveler, and happy almost Halloween. Tonight, in honor of the season, I have something truly incredible and perhaps even a bit unsettling to share with you. Something unusual has happened in the Sleep Keeper's library. You see, we keepers tend our collections in solitude, each of us devoted to our particular corner of forgotten worlds. But last week, as October's chill began to creep through these timeless halls, something drew the three of us together. It was evening, or rather, what passes for evening in a place between waking and sleeping. The historian was closing a volume about Victorian craftsmen. The myth keeper was shelving a book that glowed with stories of ancient death rituals. And I had just returned from walking through a timeline where the veil between life and death had worn dangerously thin. We found ourselves, quite without planning it, gathered around the library's central hearth. The fire there burns with a strange light, sometimes gold like the historian's scholarly candles, sometimes silver like the myth keeper's ethereal glow, sometimes the deep blue of possibility that marks my collection. The myth keeper spoke first, as she often does when boundaries blur. "The season is turning," she said softly. "Can you feel it?" October makes even the most skeptical minds wonder about what watches from the shadows. The historian nodded, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that never seems to grow cold. "I've been cataloging records of the Victorian spiritualists," he said, "the craftsmen who built tools to speak with the dead. Remarkable work, even if it was all clever fraud. And that's when I realized something that made even me, who walks through infinite possibilities, pause in wonder. I've just returned from a timeline," I said slowly, "where those tools actually worked." We looked at each other, the three keepers of forgotten worlds, and understood. Our collections had found a convergence. The historian's records of craft, my alternate histories, the myth keeper's ancient tales, all of them circling the same dark thread, the question of what lies beyond, and whether the living should ever try to reach it. The boundaries between our collections blurred that night. We could no longer tell where documented craft ended, where my alternate timelines began, where her myths took over. So we made a decision, rare in this library's long existence. This week, all three of us will explore the same haunting subject. The historian will share the lost craft of spirit photography, the Victorian art of capturing what shouldn't be seen. The myth keeper guards stories of every culture's beliefs about mirrors, reflections, and images that hold more than light. And I will take you to Edinburgh, to a timeline where cameras could photograph the dead, and one man learned too late that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. So tonight, dear listener, you're invited to experience something rare, a convergence. My colleagues and I have opened our collections to one another, and what we found in the spaces between our shelves, well, you'll see. Let me tell you about James Sinclair, post-mortem photographer of Edinburgh, in a world where the brief window between life and death could be captured on glass plates coated with silver and chemicals, where grieving families could see their loved ones one last time, suspended between planes. A world where James learned that every photograph is a threshold, and some thresholds should never be crossed. Settle in, fellow traveler. Let the sound of Edinburgh's rain carry you to a city where the past and present walk side by side, where ancient stones remember everything, and where one man's camera began to see far more than it should. In this timeline, the discovery came in 1839, the same year Daguerre announced his photographic process to the world. But here, in this version of history, a Scottish physician named Dr. Malcolm Petrie made an additional discovery while photographing his late wife. The image that developed in his chemical bath showed not just her peaceful face, but a luminous figure standing beside the body. Dr. Petrie's wife, as she had been in life, translucent but unmistakable, her hand resting on her own shoulder as if in farewell. He tried again with other recent dead, always the same result. For exactly 72 hours after death, something remained that the camera could see even when human eyes could not. After 72 hours, the phenomenon ceased. Whatever lingered was gone, moved on, dissipated into whatever comes after. By 1875, which is when our story takes place, post-mortem spirit photography had become an accepted profession in this version of Edinburgh. It wasn't common, since the expense of photography placed it beyond most families' reach, but it was respected as a profession. These were not the fraudulent spirit photographers of our timeline, using double exposures and theatrical tricks. These were craftsmen documenting a genuine, reproducible phenomenon that science had yet to explain. James Sinclair had learned the trade from his father, who had learned it from one of Dr. Petrie's original students. At 33 years old, James operated a modest studio on South Bridge, in a building that dated back to the 1700s. The ground floor served as his receiving room, where families came to arrange portraits. The first floor held his posing room, where the dead were carefully arranged. And the top floor was his darkroom, where the magic happened in chemical baths and silver-coated glass. Edinburgh itself, in this timeline, had grown accustomed to its unusual relationship with death. The city had always been comfortable with ghosts. Its old town built layer upon layer, the living walking on bridges built over streets where the dead had once lived, underground vaults holding centuries of memories. In this version of history, that comfort had simply expanded. The recently departed weren't gone, not entirely, not for 3 days. James's studio was quiet this October morning. He stood in his darkroom, preparing glass plates for the day's work. The room was lit by a single red lamp. Regular light would fog the plates, ruin the chemicals. In the crimson glow, everything looked like a scene from some alchemist's laboratory. Bottles of collodion, silver nitrate, iron sulfate, potassium cyanide. The sharp smell of ether and alcohol. The larger tanks where plates would be developed, fixed, washed. His hands moved through the process with the ease of long practice. Take a glass plate, perfectly clean. Any speck of dust could ruin an image. Pour the collodion solution across its surface, tilting the plate to coat it evenly. The collodion was sticky, viscous, catching the light like honey. It had to coat every corner, every edge. Then, while it was still slightly tacky, lower the plate into the silver nitrate bath. This was the crucial moment. In the silver bath, the collodion became light-sensitive. The plate had to stay submerged for at least 3 minutes, but not too long. Timing was everything. James counted in his head, the same count his father had taught him, the same count that stretched back to Dr. Petrie himself. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. While he counted, he thought about the day ahead. Mrs. Campbell would be arriving at 10 o'clock with her husband's body. Consumption, the usual story. Robert Campbell had been only 41, a clerk at one of the law offices on the Royal Mile. Mrs. Campbell wanted a portrait of them together, her sitting beside his arranged body, his spirit standing behind them both. A family portrait, she had said, crying softly in his receiving room. One last picture of us together. James had done hundreds of these portraits. He knew how to pose the living and the dead so they looked natural together, knew how to arrange the lighting so the spirit would show clearly without overwhelming the image, knew how to develop the plate so that the translucent, luminous quality of the spirit wasn't lost in the shadows of the living. It was intimate work, he had learned. You were present at one of life's most profound moments, the boundary between. Families trusted you to capture what they would never see with their own eyes. Proof that their loved one lingered. Proof that consciousness persisted beyond the body's failure. Proof that goodbye wasn't immediate. 3 minutes. He lifted the plate from the silver bath, holding it by the edges. Water. No, not water. Silver nitrate solution dripped from its surface. In the red light, the plate looked black, opaque, holding all its secrets. It wouldn't reveal anything until it was exposed and developed. He slid the prepared plate into a light-tight holder, then prepared another, and another. He would need 6 plates today. Mrs. Campbell would want options, different poses, different angles. And if any plates were ruined by accident or poor exposure, he needed backups. There were no second chances with post-mortem work. The family couldn't come back next week if the pictures didn't turn out. As he worked, James's mind wandered to the peculiarities of his profession. In this world, scientists had spent 36 years trying to understand what cameras captured in those 72 hours. Some called it residual energy. Others insisted it was proof of the soul. Religious authorities had debated it endlessly. Was this evidence of the afterlife, or something else entirely? James didn't pretend to understand the metaphysics. He was a craftsman, like his father before him. He knew what worked, the precise chemistry of collodion and silver, the exact exposure times needed, the development process that brought the spirit into visibility. The technical knowledge passed down through a lineage of practitioners who had refined Dr. Petrie's discovery into a reliable art. But lately, just in the past few months, James had been noticing something strange. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. In the Campbell portrait scheduled for today, this would be his chance to see if the anomaly repeated itself, or if he had been imagining things. The first strange occurrence had been in July, the Mackenzie family photographing their grandmother. When he developed the plate, there was the expected spirit, translucent, luminous, standing peacefully behind her grown children. But in the far background, barely visible, another figure, smaller, less distinct. At first, James thought it was a flaw in the glass, a smudge of dirt he'd missed in cleaning. But the shape was too regular, too deliberate. It looked like a person, standing in the corner of his posing room where no one had been standing during the exposure. He'd said nothing to the Mackenzies. The figure was faint enough that they might not even notice. And if they did, they would assume it was a trick of light or chemistry. But James had kept the glass plate after giving them their prints. He had it still, downstairs in his archive, wrapped in cloth. Sometimes, late at night, he would unwrap it and look at that background figure, trying to convince himself it was nothing. Then it happened again in August. The Davidson boy, drowned in the Firth of Forth, only 16 years old. The spirit showed clearly. young Thomas standing beside his weeping mother. But behind them, in the shadows at the edge of the frame, two figures this time, both indistinct, both positioned where his posing room was empty. And then September, just 3 weeks ago, old Mr. Sutherland, dead of age at 87. His spirit appeared as expected, but the photograph showed 5 figures in the background. 5 shapes that shouldn't be there, watching from the periphery of the image. James had checked his camera, checked his chemistry, prepared new solutions, cleaned every piece of glass and brass until they gleamed. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something in his process, or in his darkroom, or in his posing room, was changing, that his studio was becoming something other than what it had been. The clock downstairs chimed 9, an hour until the Campbells arrived. James finished preparing his plates and carried them downstairs to his posing room, their light, tight holders keeping them safe until the moment of exposure. The posing room occupied the first floor, with large windows facing north. North light was best for photography, consistent even without the harsh shadows of direct sun. The room was furnished simply: a chair for the living subject, a small platform where the deceased would be arranged, dark curtains to control the background, and his large format camera on its sturdy tripod. The camera was a brass and mahogany marvel, heavy enough that it took 2 men to lift it when it needed to be moved. The lens was Scottish made, ground by one of Edinburgh's finest opticians. Through this lens, James had captured hundreds of final farewells, the last visible trace of people before they moved on to whatever waited beyond the 72-hour window. He checked the room carefully, dusted the platform, adjusted the curtains, made sure the chair was positioned correctly relative to where Mr. Campbell's body would be arranged. Everything had to be perfect. Mrs. Campbell was paying him £2 for this session, more than a clerk's weekly wage. She deserved his absolute attention to craft. At 10 o'clock precisely, the bell above his door chimed. Mrs. Campbell had arrived. James descended to the receiving room where his assistant, young Peter Drummond, was helping Mrs. Campbell with her coat. She was a small woman in her late 30s, dressed in full mourning black. Her eyes were red from crying, but her composure was remarkable. Behind her, 2 men from the undertakers were bringing in a pine coffin. "Mrs. Campbell," James said gently, "my sincere condolences for your loss." She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then, "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair. Robert wanted this. Before he passed, he told me to come to you. He said you did the best work in Edinburgh. I'll do everything I can to give you a portrait you can treasure," James assured her. "If you'll wait here, Peter and I will prepare your husband upstairs." The undertaker's men carried the coffin up to the posing room. James and Peter opened it carefully, and James got his first look at Robert Campbell. The undertaker had done good work. Robert's face was peaceful, composed, his hands folded on his chest. He wore his best suit, and someone, probably Mrs. Campbell, had placed a sprig of heather in his lapel. He had been dead for approximately 24 hours, James calculated. Well within the 72-hour window, the spirit would show strongly. They lifted Robert from the coffin and arranged him on the platform. This was always the most delicate part, the part that required both technical knowledge and deep respect. James had learned from his father that the dead were still people, still deserving of dignity. You positioned them carefully, naturally. Sitting in a chair usually worked best, with their head supported so it didn't loll. Some photographers used special stands with clamps, but James found those grotesque. He preferred to use pillows in careful arrangement. Robert Campbell ended up seated on a simple wooden chair. His body tilted slightly so he appeared to be resting rather than rigidly upright. James adjusted the heather on his lapel, smoothed his hair. In the photograph, he would look as though he had merely paused for a moment, nothing more. "Fetch Mrs. Campbell," James told Peter. When she entered the posing room and saw her husband arranged there, she made a small sound. Not quite a sob, not quite a gasp. Something between grief and relief. James gave her a moment to compose herself. "We'll position you here," he said softly, indicating the chair he had placed beside the platform. "You'll be sitting next to Robert. According to how these portraits typically develop, his spirit will appear standing behind both of you, like he's watching over you. Does that sound appropriate?" Mrs. Campbell nodded. "Yes, that's perfect." He helped her into the chair, adjusted her position slightly. She sat very straight, very still, her hands folded in her lap, mirroring her husband's pose. There was something beautiful about her stillness, the way she held herself together through sheer force of will. James moved to his camera, sliding the first plate holder into position. "The exposure will take about 30 seconds, he explained. "You'll need to remain absolutely still during that time. Even the smallest movement will blur the image. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Very good. I'm going to remove this dark slide now, which will expose the plate. Then I'll remove the lens cap to begin the exposure. Stay very still and think of your husband. In my experience, that helps. As if your attention calls to his spirit." He had no idea if that was true, but families liked to hear it. They wanted to feel they were participating in the process, not just sitting for a mechanical reproduction. James removed the dark slide. The prepared plate was now behind the lens, ready to receive light. He positioned his hand over the lens cap, then removed it in one smooth motion. 30 seconds began. The room was absolutely silent. Mrs. Campbell sat frozen, her eyes fixed on her husband's peaceful face. Robert's body was still, of course, held in the arrangement James had created. Outside, Edinburgh continued its morning business. Carts on cobblestones, church bells, distant voices. But inside this room, time seemed suspended. James counted silently. He had developed an internal rhythm over years of practice. 1, 2, 3. The light from the north windows poured steadily into the lens, striking the silver-coated glass, beginning the chemical reactions that would capture this moment forever. 15 seconds. Halfway. Mrs. Campbell remained perfectly still, though James could see tears rolling slowly down her cheeks. That was fine. The exposure was long enough that tears wouldn't blur unless she moved her head. 25 seconds. Almost done. James found himself looking not at his subjects but around the room, at the corners, at the shadows. Were there figures there? Was something watching? Or was he simply seeing patterns in darkness, the way one does when afraid? 30 seconds. James replaced the lens cap, ending the exposure. "That's done," he said softly. "You can move now, Mrs. Campbell." She collapsed forward slightly, her rigid posture crumbling as the tension left her body. Peter moved quickly to support her, offering a handkerchief. James slid the dark slide back into the plate holder, sealing away the exposed image. "I'll develop this immediately," he told her. "It will take about an hour for the full process. Development, fixing, washing, drying. Peter will make you tea downstairs." And Mrs. Campbell, I want to take several more exposures, just to be certain we have a perfect image. Would you be willing to sit again?" "Yes," she said quietly. "As many times as you need." They repeated the process 3 more times, with slight variations in position and lighting. By the time they finished, Mrs. Campbell was exhausted, and James had 4 exposed plates ready for development. He escorted her downstairs where Peter had prepared tea and biscuits, then climbed to his darkroom with the plate holders. His hands were shaking slightly, not from the physical work, but from an anticipation he didn't want to examine too closely. What would these plates show? The darkroom welcomed him with its familiar red glow. He closed the door, locked it, nobody could enter during development, and set out his chemical baths. Developer, stop bath, fixer, washing tank. Everything in its place, everything ready. He removed the first plate from its holder. In the red light, it looked black, blank, holding all its secrets. James lowered it into the developer bath, and then began the gentle rocking motion that would encourage even development across the surface. And slowly, slowly, the image began to appear. First came the darkest areas, the shadows, the black of Mrs. Campbell's morning dress. Then the mid-tones emerged, her face pale and solemn, Robert's body peaceful in his chair, the background curtains, all of it developing exactly as it should. And then the spirit appeared. Robert Campbell's ghost was standing exactly where James had predicted, behind the 2 chairs, one translucent hand on his wife's shoulder, the other on his own body's shoulder. He looked as he had in life, middle-aged, dressed in the same suit, but his form was luminous, slightly transparent. You could see the curtain through his chest. His face wore an expression of deep peace and gentle sadness. It was perfect. Mrs. Campbell would be deeply moved by this image. James allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction. And then he saw them. Background figures. Not 5 this time, more, many more. They stood in a rough semicircle around the posed subjects, filling the edges of the frame. Some were clearer than others. Some were mere suggestions of human shape. But they were there, dozens of them, watching from every corner of his posing room. James's hands stopped their rocking motion. The plate continued to develop in the still bath, the image growing darker, more defined. The background figures became clearer. He could make out faces now on some of them. Old faces, young faces, men, women, children, all of them looking toward Mrs. Campbell and Robert's body with expressions he couldn't quite read. Were they curious, sad, hungry? James pulled the plate from the developer, too early. The image wasn't fully developed, but he couldn't bear to watch those figures become any clearer. He plunged it into the stop bath, then the fixer, his practiced hands moving through the process while his mind reeled. When the plate was fixed and washed, he held it up to the red lamp. In the crimson light, the crowd of background figures seemed to shift, seemed to move, though, of course, that was impossible. A photograph was static, frozen. The dead captured on glass plates didn't move, did they? He developed the other 3 plates. All of them showed the same phenomenon. Robert's spirit clear and defined, exactly where it should be. And behind him, around him, filling every shadow, the crowd. James stood in his dark room for a long time, red light washing over him. 4 glass plates lined up on his work surface. 4 portraits of Mrs. Campbell with her dead husband. 4 portraits showing that James Sinclair's studio had become something other than what it pretended to be. His posing room was crowded with the dead, and they were watching. James made a decision in that red-lit darkroom. He would give Mrs. Campbell her portrait, but he would crop it. The printing process allowed for such adjustments. He would make prints that showed only the center of the image, Mrs. Campbell, Robert's body, Robert's spirit standing peacefully behind them. The edges where the crowd gathered would be cut away, left on the darkroom floor. She would have her farewell portrait, beautiful and comforting, and she would never know what else had been watching from the shadows. But James would know, and James needed to understand what was happening in his studio before he photographed another family. After Mrs. Campbell left, deeply moved by her cropped portrait, pressing an extra 5 shillings into his hand in gratitude, James locked his studio's front door and hung the closed sign. It was only 3 in the afternoon, but he needed time to think, to investigate, to understand. He climbed to his archive room on the 2nd floor, where he kept the glass plates from every sitting. Hundreds of them, carefully labeled and wrapped in cloth, organized by date. His entire professional career preserved in silver and glass. James started with the most recent, the plates from September that had shown 5 background figures. He'd looked at these before, but only briefly, trying to convince himself he'd imagined the anomaly. Now he studied them with deliberate attention. Old Mr. Sutherland's portrait, the expected spirit standing behind his many children and grandchildren, and yes, there in the background, 5 figures, less distinct than the Sutherland spirit, but definitely present. James held the plate up to the window light, examining each figure carefully. One was tall, wearing what looked like clothing from decades earlier, a long coat in an old-fashioned cut. Another was shorter, possibly a child, though the details were too vague to be certain. The other 3 were mere suggestions, human-shaped shadows that might have been dismissed as flaws in the glass if James hadn't known better. He pulled out the August plate, young Thomas Davidson, the drowned boy. 2 background figures in that one. When had this started? James worked backward through his archive, pulling plate after plate, examining each one in the afternoon light from his window. July, the Mackenzie grandmother, 1 faint background figure. June, no anomalies. May, no anomalies. April, no anomalies. So it had started in July, 4 months ago. The first faint figure appearing in the background of what should have been a normal post-mortem portrait. What had changed in July? James sat on the floor of his archive room, surrounded by glass plates, trying to remember. It was a normal month, wasn't it? He'd photographed how many families? He checked his ledger, 7 sittings in July. The Mackenzie portrait was the last one of the month, July 28th. Before that, on July 15th, he'd photographed the Wallace family. He pulled that plate. No background figures, just the expected spirit of Mr. Wallace. So something had changed between July 15th and July 28th. James closed his eyes, trying to recall those 2 weeks. What had he done? How had his routine varied? And then he remembered. The darkroom repairs. In mid-July, he'd noticed water damage on the ceiling of his darkroom, a leak from the roof that was staining the plaster. He'd hired a mason to repair it, which meant the man had broken through some of the plaster to access the roof timbers, fixed the leak, then replastered the ceiling. James climbed to his darkroom, looking up at the ceiling with new eyes. The repair was barely visible. The mason had done good work, but the area he'd opened was directly above James's developing tanks, right where James stood when watching images appear in the chemical baths. What had been behind that plaster? The building was old, dating back to the 1700s, built on Edinburgh's South Bridge, which itself was built over the old streets of the city. James's studio occupied what had been residential rooms once. Before that, he didn't know. The building's history was lost in Edinburgh's layered past. He thought about the city's geography. The South Bridge was one of Edinburgh's famous bridges that weren't really bridges at all. They were built over existing streets, creating underground vaults. Entire neighborhoods had been buried when the bridges went up, and those underground spaces had become home to the desperate, the criminal, the forgotten. Eventually they'd been sealed, but they were still there, beneath the streets, beneath the buildings, beneath James's studio. He'd never thought about it before, but now the realization crept over him like cold water. His darkroom, where he developed photographs of the dead, was built directly above Edinburgh's buried city, above vaults that had been sealed for decades, where countless people had lived and died in squalor and darkness. When the mason broke through the ceiling, had he opened something? Not just a physical crack in the plaster, but something else? Some boundary that had been sealed? James stood in his red-lit darkroom, looking at the repaired ceiling, and felt understanding settle over him like a weight. His studio had always been a threshold, a place where the living came to glimpse the dead, where cameras captured what eyes couldn't see. But it had been a controlled threshold, limited to the 72-hour window, limited to the specific spirits of the recently deceased. Now that threshold had widened. The crowd of watchers in his photographs weren't the recent dead. They were older. They were the accumulated dead of Edinburgh itself, drawn to this place where the boundary between worlds was already thin, made thinner by the breaking of the ceiling, by the opening of what should have remained sealed. And with each photograph he took, with each time he developed a plate and watched spirits emerge from the chemical darkness, he was opening that threshold wider. James thought of Mrs. Campbell sitting in his receiving room, while just upstairs, her husband's portrait developed in a room full of watching dead. He thought of all the families who would come after her seeking comfort, seeking proof that their loved ones persisted. Could he continue? Should he? The practical part of his mind, the part that thought about rent and supplies and Peter's wages, said yes. This was his profession, his livelihood. The background figures weren't hurting anyone. He could keep cropping them out, keep giving families their comforting portraits, keep the truth to himself. But another part of him, the part that had spent years capturing threshold moments between life and death, knew that some doors shouldn't be opened, and once opened, they might not be closable. He thought about Dr. Malcolm Petrie, who had discovered spirit photography back in 1839. Petrie had spent his whole life studying the phenomenon, trying to understand what cameras captured in those 72 hours. Had he ever seen background figures? Had he ever noticed his darkroom becoming crowded? James needed to know if this had happened to others, if there was precedent, if there was knowledge about what to do when a threshold widened beyond control. He decided to visit the Royal Society of Edinburgh. There, Dr. Petrie's papers were archived. Somewhere in those documents, there might be answers, or perhaps even warnings. The next morning, James left Peter in charge of the studio. He took a cab across the city to the Society's building on George Street. The archive room was a beautiful space, high ceilings, tall windows, leather-bound volumes lining the walls. A young librarian helped him locate the Petrie collection, For hours, James read through Dr. Petrie's meticulously kept notes. The doctor had documented everything about his discovery: the chemicals he used, the exposure times he found most effective, the way spirits appeared in photographs. He'd theorized about what was being captured. Residual energy, he called it, though he admitted this was speculation rather than scientific fact. But nowhere in the early papers did Petrie mention background figures. His spirit photographs showed only what they should: the intended subject's translucent form, clearly defined, appearing in the expected location. James kept reading, working chronologically through Petrie's career. 1839, 1840, 1841, all standard documentation. Then 1847, and James found this entry. Something unusual occurred during today's development. The Morrison family portraits showed not only young Margaret's spirit, but 2 additional figures in the background. Upon examination, I concluded this was likely a double exposure caused by improper sealing of the plate holder. However, I note this for future reference, as the figures appeared remarkably distinct for a chemical error. Asterisk. James's pulse quickened. He read on. 1848. The background figures have appeared again, this time in 3 separate plates. I can no longer attribute this to chemical error. The figures are too consistent, too deliberately positioned. They appear to be watching the primary subject. I have decided not to mention this phenomenon to the families, as it would only cause distress. 1849. I have begun to fear my darkroom. The background figures now appear in nearly every photograph I develop, sometimes dozens of them, crowding the edges of the frame. I wake at night thinking about them. Who are they? Why do they gather? And why can my camera see them when my eyes cannot? 1850. I have made a terrible realization. The figures are not random spirits drawn to my studio. They are specific. Upon careful examination of recent plates, I recognize faces, people I photographed years ago. The dead I have captured on glass are not moving on. They are staying, accumulating. My studio has become a place where spirits linger instead of departing. James's hands were shaking as he turned the pages. Petrie's handwriting became more erratic as the entries continued. 1851. I can no longer develop plates in my darkroom. When I stand in that red-lit space, I feel them watching, not through the camera, watching me directly. The boundary has worn too thin. I am visible to them now, just as they are visible to my camera. I have discontinued my practice. This discovery, which brought such comfort to grieving families, has become something dangerous, a threshold that should never have been opened. And then the final entry, dated January 1852. I have destroyed all my equipment, camera, plates, chemicals, everything burned or buried. I advise any who read this: do not practice this art in the same location for too long. Do not allow the threshold to stabilize. Move your darkroom frequently. Change your studios. Never let one place become too thin. And if you begin to see the background figures, stop immediately. Close your practice, walk away. Some doors, once fully opened, cannot be closed again. I have learned this too late. After that entry, nothing. James checked the biographical notes attached to Petrie's papers. Dr. Malcolm Petrie had died in 1853 at the age of 58. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. But there was a note that he had been found in his home alone, with an expression on his face that witnesses described as profoundly disturbed. James closed the archive folder with trembling hands. The librarian noticed his distress. "Are you quite all right, sir?" "Yes," James lied. "Just the doctor's later writings are rather dark." Indeed, a tragic end for such a brilliant man. They say he went mad towards the end, claimed his house was full of ghosts. Of course, given his profession, one understands the fixation. James thanked the librarian and left the building, stepping out into Edinburgh's grey afternoon. Around him, the living city went about its business, carts and carriages, shopkeepers and clerks, children playing, all of them walking on streets built over other streets, living in buildings constructed on top of older structures. Edinburgh was a city of layers, of accumulated history, of the past buried beneath the present. And somewhere beneath all of it, in the sealed vaults and forgotten closes, the dead of centuries waited. James had been operating his studio on South Bridge for 8 years. 8 years in the same darkroom, standing above those sealed vaults, photographing the dead, developing their spirits in chemical baths, creating a threshold that grew thinner with each passing year. Petrie had worked for less than 12 years before it became unbearable. How much time did James have before his darkroom became something more than a workplace? Before the watching spirits decided to do more than watch? He thought about simply walking away as Petrie had advised, closing his practice, finding new work, leaving the studio on South Bridge to someone else. But what would happen then? Would the threshold close, or would it continue to widen? Would the next tenant find themselves in a room crowded with watching dead? No. If this was James's doing, if his 8 years of work had opened this door, then he had a responsibility to close it. But how did one close a threshold between worlds? James spent a sleepless night in his rooms above the studio, listening to the building settle and creak around him. Every sound seemed meaningful, seemed like footsteps or whispers or the movement of things that should be still. He knew it was his imagination. Petrie's writings had unsettled him deeply, but knowing didn't make the fear less real. By morning, he had decided on a course of action. If the problem was spiritual rather than chemical, he needed spiritual help. In this Edinburgh, where cameras could photograph the dead, there were also genuine mediums, people who could sense and communicate with spirits without mechanical aid. James knew of one medium who had a reputation for honesty. Mrs. Helena Blackwood operated a small consulting room on the Royal Mile. And unlike many of her profession, she was known for telling clients when she sensed nothing, rather than inventing false messages to collect fees. If anyone could help him understand what was happening in his studio, it would be her. He arrived at her door at 10 in the morning. The building was old and narrow, squeezed between a bookseller and a tea merchant. A small brass plaque read, H. Blackwood, Spiritual Consultant by Appointment. James knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting. Mrs. Blackwood was a woman in her late 40s, with steel gray hair pulled back severely and dark eyes that seemed to look through rather than at him. She wore a simple black dress, practical rather than theatrical. No crystal balls or mystical nonsense visible in her entrance hall. "Mr. Sinclair," she said. "You were expecting me?" A slight smile. "No. In my line of work, your reputation precedes you. We all know who you are. But I can see distress in your face. Given your presence here, I'm assuming something has gone wrong with your practice. James felt a weight lift slightly. Here was someone who might understand. Yes, may I consult with you? She led him to a small sitting room at the back of the building. It was spare but comfortable, with 2 chairs facing each other and a small table between them. No theatrical darkness, no incense, just a quiet room with good light from a window overlooking a narrow courtyard. Tell me what's troubling you, she said once they were seated. James told her everything, the background figures appearing in his photographs, the timeline of their emergence starting after the ceiling repairs, his discovery of Petrie's papers and the doctor's warnings, his growing fear that his darkroom had become a threshold that he could no longer control. Mrs. Blackwood listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as he spoke. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. May I see one of these photographs? She asked finally. James had brought the Campbell plate, the one showing dozens of background figures. He unwrapped it carefully and handed it to her. Mrs. Blackwood held the glass plate up to the window light, studying it intently. Her face went pale. Mr. Sinclair, she said quietly, how long have you been working in that studio? 8 years. And you photographed how many dead in that time? He did quick arithmetic. Perhaps 300, maybe more. She set the plate down carefully on the table between them. Do you know what you've created? A threshold, James said. That's what Petrie called it. It's more than a threshold. You've created an anchor point. Every spirit you've photographed has left an impression in that space. In most places, spirits pass through naturally. They linger for those 72 hours, then they dissipate and move on. But your dark room has become a place where they can linger longer, where they can gather, where they can watch. How do I close it? James asked. You can't, she said simply. Not completely. You've worn the path too deep, but you can make it less inviting, less habitable for spirits. You can discourage them from lingering. James felt his hope deflate. How? Mrs. Blackwood turned back to face him. First, you must stop photographing the dead in that location. Every new spirit you bring through that space makes it easier for others to follow. No more post-mortem work in that studio. But that's my livelihood. Find another location. Move your practice to different premises, or change professions entirely. But you cannot continue as you have been. Every photograph you develop in that darkroom now serves as an invitation to spirits throughout Edinburgh. You're creating a beacon, Mr. Sinclair, a gathering place for the dead. James thought about his lease, his equipment, his clients. But he thought more about Petrie's fate, found dead with a look of profound disturbance, claiming his house was full of ghosts. What else? He asked. Second, you must cleanse the space. Not with prayer or holy water. This isn't a religious matter. It's a matter of accumulated spiritual energy. You need to physically alter the darkroom. Paint the walls, replace the floor if possible, change the configuration of the space. Make it no longer recognizable as the place where all those photographs were developed. Interrupt the pattern. And third. Mrs. Blackwood's expression became grave. Third, you must develop one final photograph, not of a person but of the darkroom itself, a self-portrait of the space. And when you develop that plate, you must speak to the spirits gathered there. Tell them clearly that the door is closing. that they must move on, that this is no longer a place for lingering. Can they hear me? Will they even listen? Some will, some won't, but you must try. The alternative is to let the threshold continue, widening until, she paused, choosing her words carefully, until it becomes something more than a photograph studio. Until it becomes a place where the boundary between life and death has worn so thin that the living and dead occupy the same space simultaneously. James thought of Petrie, alone in his house seeing ghosts that no one else could see. How do I photograph the darkroom itself? He asked. The room must be dark for photography. Use a long exposure. Light a single candle. Place it in the center of the room. Let the camera capture the darkness with that one point of light. The spirits will gather around the light. They always do. And when you develop that plate, you'll see them clearly. All of them. And they'll see you. There was something in her tone that made James ask, "Have you done this before? Closed a threshold?" Mrs. Blackwood smiled sadly. "Why do you think I no longer conduct seances, Mr. Sinclair? Why do you think I work only in this small consulting room, never the same place twice a week, always keeping my practice moving? Some of us learned the same lessons Dr. Petrie did. We learned to be careful about creating anchor points." She walked him to the door, then paused before opening it. "One more thing. When you develop that final photograph, you'll see faces you recognize among the gathered spirits. People you photographed years ago. They've been watching you all this time, Mr. Sinclair. Remember that as you speak to them. They're not malevolent, just curious. Just drawn to a place where they could linger a little longer. Be kind in your dismissal." James left her building feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. He had a plan now, a way forward. But that plan required him to confront directly what he'd been trying not to think about. His darkroom was full of watching dead, and he would have to face them. James spent the next week preparing. He told Peter he was closing the practice due to health concerns, not entirely untrue. He then sent letters to his regular clients, informing them he could no longer serve them. The letters were hard to write. Each one felt like an admission of failure, or worse, an admission of fear. But he thought of Dr. Petrie, and he wrote them anyway. Then came the practical preparations. He would need to photograph his darkroom, which meant setting up his camera in an unusual configuration. The room was small, barely 10 feet square. He would have to position the camera in the doorway, pointing inward, to capture the full space. He prepared a plate using his usual collodion process, but with extra care. This plate had to be perfect. He would only have one chance at this. On a Friday evening, when the city outside was settling into its weekend rhythms, James climbed to his darkroom for what might be the final time. The red lamp was lit, casting its familiar crimson glow over the space where he'd spent so many hours bringing images to life. He looked around the room, really looked at it, perhaps for the first time in years. The stained developing tanks, the shelves of chemical bottles, the clotheslines where plates hung to dry, the repaired section of ceiling that had started all of this. It was just a room, just a workplace. But Mrs. Blackwood was right. It had become something more. James positioned his camera in the dark way, angling it to capture as much of the darkroom as possible. He placed a single white candle in the center of the floor, exactly as Mrs. Blackwood had instructed. Then he loaded the prepared plate into the camera. The exposure would need to be long, perhaps 5 minutes, to capture the darkroom in candlelight. James lit the candle, watching its flame steady and grow bright. He extinguished the red lamp. It would interfere with the photograph. In the sudden darkness broken only by candlelight, the darkroom looked different. Shadows gathered in the corners. The bottles on the shelves seemed to glow faintly. The developing tanks reflected the candle's flame in their still chemical surfaces. James removed the dark slide from his camera, exposing the prepared plate. Then he removed the lens cap. 5 minutes began. He stood very still in the doorway, his hand still on the camera, watching his darkroom by candlelight. The flame flickered occasionally, sending shadows dancing across the walls. The building settled around him with its usual creaks and groans. And slowly, gradually, James became aware that he was not alone. It started as a sensation, the feeling of being watched, something he'd been experiencing for months. But now, in the darkness, with his camera capturing what eyes couldn't see, the sensation intensified. The air in the dark room grew colder. The candle flame flickered more violently, though there was no draft. James wanted to look away, to step back from the doorway, to end the exposure early and flee. But he forced himself to remain still. If this was going to work, if he was going to close this threshold, he had to face what he'd created. The shadows in the corners seemed to solidify slightly. Nothing dramatic, just a sense of presence, of occupancy. The empty darkroom was no longer empty. They were here, the gathered dead, the spirits he'd photographed over 8 years, the others who had been drawn to this anchor point, this place where the boundary was thin. James's voice came out as a whisper at first, then stronger as he continued. I know you're here. I've seen you in my photographs. I understand now what I've done. I've created a place where you could linger, where the path between worlds was easier to walk. But I can't continue this work. This threshold has to close. The candle flame steadied slightly, as if in response. You're not trapped here, James continued. The 72 hours have long passed for all of you. You can move on. You should move on. Whatever waits beyond, it's meant for you. Not this halfway place, not this dark room where time has stopped. He paused, remembering Mrs. Blackwood's advice to be kind. These weren't malevolent spirits, just lost ones, or curious ones, or lonely ones. I'm grateful, he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. My work brought comfort to families. The portraits I made helped people say goodbye. You were part of that, even if they never saw you watching from the edges. But that work is done now. I'm closing this practice. I'm altering this space. There will be no more anchors here, no more reasons to linger. The cold in the dark room intensified, and for a moment James felt genuine fear. What if they didn't want to leave? What if they couldn't? What if? But then, gradually the cold began to ease. The shadows in the corners seemed less solid. The sense of crowding, of too many presences in too small a space, began to dissipate. They were listening. They were leaving. James stayed still, watching the candle, counting silently toward 5 minutes. The exposure needed to be complete. The photograph needed to capture this moment, the final moment when his darkroom was crowded with the dead, before they moved on. When 5 minutes had passed, he replaced the lens cap, ending the exposure. Then he slid the dark slide back into place, sealing away whatever image had been captured on the glass. The dark room felt different now. Not empty, it would probably never feel truly empty again, but no longer crowded. The watching presences had diminished. Some had gone. Maybe not all, but some. Now came the hardest part, developing the plate he'd just exposed, seeing what his camera had captured, confronting directly what he'd been photographing indirectly for months. James lit the red lamp again, re-establishing the darkroom's familiar crimson glow. He prepared his chemical baths with shaking hands. Developer, stop bath, fixer, wash, everything ready. He removed the plate from its holder. It looked black, blank, holding all its secrets just like every other plate he'd developed in this room, but this one was different. This one would show him truth he wasn't sure he wanted to see. James lowered the plate into the developer bath, began the gentle rocking motion, and watched. Slowly the image emerged, the dark room in candlelight captured in shades of gray, the developing tanks in the foreground, the shelves of bottles in the background, the single candle in the center, its flame a bright point of light. And then, the figures. They filled the frame. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, crowding every available space in the small dark room. Some were clearer than others, translucent human forms, faces recognizable, bodies distinct. Others were mere suggestions, shadows with the hint of human shape. They were all looking toward the candle, just as Mrs. Blackwood had predicted, drawn to the light like moths, like pilgrims, like lost things seeking direction. And James recognized faces among them. There, old Mr. Sutherland, whom he'd photographed in September. And there, young Thomas Davidson, the drowned boy from August. Mrs. Mackenzie's grandmother from July, standing near the back. And dozens more, faces from portraits he'd taken years ago. All of them gathered here, all of them lingering in this space he'd created. But as James watched the image develop further, he noticed something that sent a chill through him. The figures weren't looking at the candle. Not all of them. Some of them were looking directly at the camera, looking at where James had been standing during the exposure, looking at him. Their expressions weren't threatening. They were curious, sad, grateful maybe. The faces of people who had found a place to rest for a while and were now being asked to move on. James pulled the plate from the developer before it could develop any further. He didn't want to see more detail, didn't want those watching faces to become any clearer. Into the stop bath, then the fixer, then the wash. His hands moved through the familiar process while his mind reeled from what he'd seen. When the plate was fixed and washed, he held it up to the red lamp one final time. The crowd of spirits looked back at him from the glass, frozen forever in silver and collodion, a record of what his darkroom had become, a testament to 8 years of creating a threshold between worlds. And then James did something he'd never done before in his professional career. He deliberately destroyed a photograph. He took the glass plate, still wet from the washing tank, and dropped it on the stone floor of the darkroom. It shattered into dozens of pieces, the carefully captured image fracturing into fragments. The faces of the watching dead scattered across the floor in shards of broken glass. Some records, James decided, were not meant to be preserved. The next morning, James hired workmen to repaint the darkroom. He supervised as they covered the red-stained walls with fresh white paint, as they sanded the floor smooth, as they replaced the window glass with new panes. Every surface was transformed, made new, made unrecognizable, as the space where hundreds of spirits had been photographed. While the painters worked, James dismantled his developing equipment. The tanks went to a second-hand dealer. The bottles of chemicals he disposed of carefully, pouring them into the sewer as regulations required. The red lamp he smashed, just as he'd smashed the final photograph. He kept his camera. A photographer without a camera seemed wrong somehow, but he moved it to storage. Perhaps someday he would use it again, in a different location, for different subjects, but not for post-mortem work. Never again for that. Peter found work with another photographer easily enough. The boy was skilled, and Edinburgh always needed assistance. James wrote him a glowing reference, and they parted on good terms, though Peter never quite understood why his master had closed such a successful practice. Within a week, James had transformed his studio on South Bridge. The ground floor became a bookshop. He rented it to a dealer in antiquarian volumes. The first floor, his former posing room, he converted into his living quarters. The second floor, his archive room, he emptied completely. The glass plates, his entire career's worth of portraits, he donated to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, where they would be preserved, but not displayed. Let future historians study them if they wished. He couldn't bear to look at them anymore. And the top floor, his former darkroom, the space where the threshold had been. James sealed it. He had the door bricked up from the outside, creating a wall where the entrance had been. Let the room sit empty and dark forever, no longer accessible, no longer used. Let whatever remained there fade naturally, without reinforcement, without anchor points. For his livelihood, James found work as a teacher of photographic techniques. Edinburgh had several photography schools, and his expertise in the collodion process was valued. He taught students how to prepare plates, how to expose them correctly, how to develop images in chemical baths. But he never taught post-mortem photography. That particular skill, he decided, should die with his generation. One December evening, as the year 1875 drew toward its close, James received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 20s appeared at his door, holding a carefully wrapped package. "Mr. Sinclair, my name is Catherine Campbell. You photographed my father last October." James invited her in, though he felt a pang of anxiety. Had something gone wrong with the portrait he'd given her mother? But Catherine's face was kind, even peaceful. "My mother passed away 2 weeks ago," she said quietly, quite suddenly in her sleep. She was only 39, but the doctor said her heart simply stopped. "I'm very sorry for your loss." "Thank you." She was at peace, I think. She'd been struggling since father died, but that photograph you made, the one of them together, gave her such comfort. She kept it on her bedside table. It was the last thing she looked at every night. Catherine unwrapped the package, revealing the portrait James had taken in October. Mrs. Campbell sitting beside her husband's body, his spirit standing peacefully behind them both, the edges carefully cropped to remove the crowd of watching dead that James had seen in the full plate. "I'm moving to Glasgow," Catherine continued, "and I can't take everything with me. But I wanted to return this to you. I thought you might want to keep it as an example of your work. It's a beautiful photograph, Mr. Sinclair. It brought my mother comfort when she needed it most." James looked at the portrait, one of his last commissions created when his darkroom was crowded with unseen spirits. But Catherine was right, it was beautiful. The composition was balanced, the spirit captured clearly, the love between the subjects evident even across the boundary of death. "Thank you for bringing this to me," he said. "I'm honored that it helped your mother." After Catherine left, James sat alone in his living quarters, holding the portrait in his hands. He thought about Dr. Petrie's discovery in 1839, how it had brought comfort to countless families across this timeline. He thought about his own 8 years of work, the hundreds of portraits he'd created, the goodbyes he'd helped facilitate. Yes, it had become dangerous. Yes, he'd had to close his practice. Yes, the threshold had grown too wide, too unstable. But before all that, before the background figures and the watching dead and the realization that some doors shouldn't be opened, before all that, there had been good work, real comfort, genuine help for grieving families who needed to see that their loved ones had persisted, even briefly, even just for 72 hours. The craft itself wasn't evil. The threshold wasn't inherently wrong. It was the accumulation that had been dangerous, the wearing of the path too deep, the anchor point stabilizing too permanently. James placed the Campbell portrait on his own bedside table, where it remains to this day in that timeline, a reminder of both his career's purpose and its necessary end, a testament to good work that had to stop before it became something terrible. And in the sealed room above him, in the darkness that had once been red-lit and full of watching dead, something that had been crowded gradually became empty. Not all at once, not immediately, but slowly, over months and years, the spirits who had lingered moved on. The anchor point faded, the threshold closed, or at least narrowed to what it should be, a natural thin place, in a city full of thin places but nothing more. James Sinclair lived another 43 years in that building on South Bridge. He taught photography until he was too old to hold a camera steady. He watched as the Victorian era gave way to the Edwardian, as Edinburgh grew and modernized, as the practice of post-mortem spirit photography gradually declined in popularity as society's relationship with death shifted. He never opened the sealed darkroom, never broke through the brick wall to see what, if anything, remained in that red-lit space where he'd created 1,000 thresholds between worlds. When he died in 1918 at the age of 76, his will contained specific instructions. The sealed room on the top floor was never to be opened. It was to remain sealed, undisturbed, forgotten. Let some boundaries remain closed. Let some thresholds stay dark. I close this particular volume carefully, running my hands over its cover. The book feels different than others in my collection. Not just an alternate history, but a cautionary tale that exists in the space between possibility and warning. You see, James Sinclair's story troubles me in ways that my other volumes rarely do. I walk through timelines where everything went right, where the catastrophe didn't happen, where wisdom prevailed over destruction. The gardens of New Pompeii, the library of Alexandria that survived, the peaceful first contact between civilizations. But the Edinburgh Testament shows something different, a timeline where a discovery that brought comfort also brought danger, where a technology meant to help people say goodbye created something that wouldn't let go, where the tools we build to pierce the veil between worlds might open doors we can't close. I wonder what my colleague, the historian, would say about the real Victorian spirit photographers of our timeline. He knows about them, of course, the frauds and charlatans who used double exposures and theatrical tricks to convince grieving families they could see the dead. There's a craft to that deception, a skill in creating the illusion of continued existence. Were they cruel, those fraudulent spiritualists? Or were they providing a service, a comfort? a necessary lie that helped people process grief. The historian preserves their techniques in his archives: the hidden mirrors, the prepared plates, the chemical tricks, the craftsmanship of deception, practiced with care and skill. And the Mythkeeper, in her luminous collection, guards stories that the Edinburgh Testament echoes. Every culture has myths about capturing souls, about images that hold more than light. The ancient Greeks believed mirrors could trap the dying. Some indigenous cultures feared that photographs stole pieces of the spirit. The Mythkeeper's books glow with these warnings, passed down through generations. Be careful what you capture. Be careful what you see. Be careful about doors that open both ways. In my wanderings through alternate timelines, I've seen so many variations on this theme. Scientists who discover something powerful and can't resist pushing further. Craftsmen who perfect a technique and can't stop refining it. Explorers who find a door and can't resist seeing what's on the other side. James was different. He found the door, realized it was opening wider than it should, and he closed it, sealed it, walked away. There's a kind of heroism in that restraint, a courage in stepping back from the threshold rather than crossing it. Perhaps that's the real lesson of the Edinburgh Testament. Not that we shouldn't explore the boundaries between worlds, but that we must be prepared to step back when those boundaries begin to dissolve. That wisdom sometimes means restraint. That the most powerful choice we can make is the choice to stop. If you found yourself drawn to James Sinclair's story tonight, perhaps it's because you understand something about thresholds, about the choices we make when we discover we've created something more powerful than we intended, about the courage it takes to step back from the edge of discovery and say, this far, but no farther. Thank you for walking with me tonight through this particular timeline, this story of cameras and spirits, and the boundaries between worlds. If you found something troubling in James's story, something that unsettled you even as it lulled you towards sleep, good. The best stories are the ones that make us think, that linger in our minds, that ask questions without providing easy answers. Next week, I'll return with another volume from my collection, another path not taken, another world that might have been. The historian will share his knowledge of Victorian spiritualist crafts, the actual tools and techniques of those who claimed to speak with the dead. And the Mythkeeper will open her glowing books to show us the ancient stories that inspired it all, the myths that warned us about mirrors and reflections, and images that hold more than light. We three keepers have found our collections converging this October, drawn together by the season when boundaries blur, and the dead feel closer than usual. It's appropriate, I think. We each tend different kinds of knowledge, but sometimes our shelves speak to each other. Our volumes share themes, our stories intertwine. Sleep well, fellow traveler. May your dreams be gentle, your rest be deep, and your own thresholds remain safely closed until morning's light calls you back to the waking world. Until we meet again among the paths not taken, good night.